Somewhere in the Lincoln County Recorder's office in Peoria, Nevada, there is a bound ledger of land and mineral transactions from 1947. Page 118 records a mineral rights inquiry filed on April 3rd of that year by a two-man crew from a small geological consulting outfit called Halloran and Cobb. Their listed destination: a dry lakebed roughly 11 miles northeast of the Groom mine, out in the empty quarter of the county that nobody had bothered naming on the official plats, though the men working the district had been calling it Groom Lake for as long as anyone could remember. Beneath the entry, in a different hand and a darker ink, someone added a single word, evidently later: returned. No date attached to it. No explanation. That word is the entire paper trail the county left behind for whatever those two men were doing out on the flat in the spring of 1947. And it is, as far as I've been able to trace it, the root of a story that a small number of people in eastern Nevada have been telling each other for most of the past 70 years. A story about a hole that opened in the desert floor, and about something built underneath it that nobody in 1947 was equipped to explain, and that nobody, as far as the honest record shows, has explained since. I want to lay out what actually happened, or at least what the documented history supports, before I get to what people say happened. The ordinary version of this story is a real one, and it deserves to be told straight. Groom Lake is a playa, a dry lake bed, formed by the slow evaporation of a much larger body of water that existed during the wetter climate of the last glacial period. It's part of a pattern repeated across the Great Basin, dozens of these pluvial lakes drying down over thousands of years into flat pans of clay and alkali, hard enough in most seasons to land an airplane on, which is more or less exactly what would happen there later. By the time anyone was keeping written records of the area, Groom Lake was simply that. A flat, white expanse roughly 10 square miles in size, ringed by low desert ranges. The Groom Range along its eastern edge, the Papoose Range to the southwest. Low brown mountains that catch orange light for about 20 minutes at sunset, and then go the colour of a bruise. For most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the only people with regular business out there were prospectors. The Groom mining district, a few miles south of the lakebed itself, had been worked on and off since the 1870s for lead, silver, and small amounts of gold, and the Groom Mine, a modest operation eventually run by the Sheehan family, kept limited activity going even into the years following the Second World War. During the war, a large stretch of southern Nevada, Groom Lake included, sat inside the boundary of a bombing and gunnery range used to train pilots before they shipped out. When the war ended in 1945, much of that land reverted to ordinary use. Grazing leases picked back up, small mining claims got worked again. There was no fence around Groom Lake in 1947. No gate, no guard shack, no classified program of any kind. The military didn't return to the lakebed in any serious way until 1955, when the Air Force and the Central Intelligence Agency selected it as a remote, defensible location to test a new reconnaissance aircraft, the U-2, under a project that the public would eventually come to know as Area 51. Everything that place is famous for today, the secrecy, the perimeter, the decades of rumour, grew out of that 1955 decision. Not out of anything that happened 8 years before it. That's the version supported by declassified Air Force and CIA histories. by the land withdrawal records that do survive, and by the Shahan family itself, who held mineral rights near the lakebed well after the base went in, and who spent years afterward negotiating access with the government. There is no verified evidence, none, of any ancient structure beneath Groom Lake, and no credible geological survey has ever reported one. Whatever happened in April of 1947, if anything happened at all, left no mark on any history that a historian, a journalist, or the government itself has ever been willing to confirm. So where does a story about buried stone corridors come from? As far as I can trace it, it comes from that one word in the ledger, and from the fact that Halloran and Cobb, the firm that filed the original inquiry, appears to stop existing in any public record after the autumn of 1947. I spent a good stretch of time trying to run them down. A 2 or 3 man geological consulting outfit wasn't required to file much with the state in those years, but firms that worked. Mining claims usually left some trace, a line in a trade directory, a mention in an assayer's correspondence, an entry in a county business license book. Halloran and Cobb shows up exactly twice that I could find, once in that April ledger entry, and once in a classified notice in a Lincoln County weekly from February of the same year, seeking, in the paper's words, 2 experienced men for short-term desert fieldwork. After April, nothing. No dissolution filing, no forwarding address, no mention in any newspaper, obituary or business register in Nevada or the surrounding states that I could locate. 2 men who advertised for work in February and filed a routine survey inquiry in April simply stop appearing in the record that same spring. On its own, that could mean almost anything. Small outfits folded constantly in the post-war West. Men changed trades, moved on, went bust, drifted to California for defense work. It's the kind of gap that shows up in rural county archives more often than people assume, and I don't want to oversell it, but it's the hinge the rest of the story turns on, because it's the gap that the old-timers in the district, the ones whose parents and grandparents worked the Groom mines, built their account around. The fullest version of it that survives comes from an oral history project run out of a small regional folklore archive in the 1970s, when a handful of researchers went around eastern Nevada with reel-to-reel tape recorders, sitting down with aging ranchers and miners before that generation was gone. One of the people they recorded was a man named Walter Pruitt, who by then was in his 70s and had spent most of his life running cattle in the Tikaboo Valley, within sight of the Groom Range. According to the transcript, Pruitt said that in the spring of 1947, when he was a young man working for his father's outfit, 2 men came through looking to hire a local guide who knew the desert well enough to get them out to the lake and back without losing a truck axle on the caliche. He said he took the job for $3 a day, drove them out in an old flatbed, and made camp with them near the northeast shoreline of the lakebed for what he remembered as 4 or 5 nights. He said the 2 men spent the first 2 days doing what he described as ordinary survey work. Running lines with a transit, driving stakes, taking rock samples, the kind of thing he'd seen mining men do 100 times. Then, on what he believed was the 3rd day, one of them, Pruitt only ever referred to him as the older one, put a boot through a soft patch of ground near the lake's edge and dropped through it up to his hip. What opened beneath him, according to the account, wasn't a rodent burrow or a collapsed mine adit. It was a gap in worked stone, roofed with what looked like a slab. that had been buried under maybe 18 inches of wind-blown silt and clay. I want to be careful here, because this is the part of the story that has no documentary backing whatsoever. And everything from this point forward is legend. Passed mouth to mouth. Recorded decades after the fact. Filtered through a young ranch hand's 70-year-old memory and whatever the two surveyors told him at a campfire, which is not exactly a chain of evidence anybody should treat as established. But it's worth describing in full, because the specificity is exactly what has kept people telling it. According to the account, the two men widened the opening enough to lower a lantern and then themselves into it. And what they found, by Pruitt's telling, was not a mine shaft or a natural cave, but a passage. A corridor cut and fitted from stone, running level and straight in a direction he couldn't judge underground. Wide enough, in his recollection of what they told him, for a wagon to pass through it, twice over. The field notebook that supposedly documented the descent is not something I've been able to locate, if it ever existed outside of the story itself. But the account describes measurements consistent with a notebook. A corridor sited at somewhere between 18 and 22 feet wide, floored in fitted stone, walled in massive blocks, the story describes as running roughly 4 feet by 4 feet by upward of 9 feet, dressed smooth and set without visible mortar. The kind of coursed ashlar masonry a stonemason would call cyclopean. Blocks large enough that no crew with 1947 hand tools could plausibly have moved them, let alone fitted them. The passage was said to open, after some distance, into a chamber. The story describes a domed or corbelled ceiling, rising overhead into darkness their lanterns couldn't reach, and a rough pacing off of the floor that put its diameter somewhere close to 200 feet. Around its perimeter, according to the account, stood pillars, not decorative columns, but load-bearing stone piers, square in cross-section, that the two men estimated, by sighting up along the beam of their lights, at something past 180 feet in height, vanishing into a ceiling neither of them could see the top of. A staircase was said to lead off from one side of the chamber, its risers unusually tall, closer to 11 inches than the standard 7, which is part of what apparently convinced the two men, or convinced whoever first told this story afterward, that whatever built the passage hadn't built it to a human scale. At the far end of a second corridor, the account describes a sealed doorway. Not an opening, but a slab, estimated at somewhere around 14 feet high and several feet thick, fitted into the surrounding stone with no visible hinge, hasp, or seam, closed and, as far as the story goes, never opened. Pruitt said the two men came up out of the ground that night, rattled in a way he'd never seen in grown men before or since. He said the older one didn't sleep and spent most of the night sketching by lamplight in a notebook, and that, by the next morning, they decided to fill the opening back in with loose rock and brush, cover their tracks, and head back to town early, a full day ahead of schedule. He said the older one paid him double what they'd agreed and told him, in words Pruitt claimed he never forgot, that it would be better for everyone if he didn't mention the hole to anybody. Pruitt says he mostly kept that promise for 25 years, until a folklorist with a tape recorder finally asked him the right question. That's the oral history. It is, by any reasonable standard, uncorroborated, a decades-old recollection of second-hand claims made by two men who then disappear from the record entirely. I'm not asking you to believe it, but it's not the only strand in this particular rope, and the rest of what I found is what kept me looking longer than I probably should have. The first thread is a survey revision. The General Land Office plat covering that section of Lincoln County was quietly redrawn in 1948, shifting a section line boundary by a small but measurable distance near the lake's northeast shore. The exact area Pruitt's account places the opening. County surveyor minutes from that period, what survives of them, don't explain the revision. Section lines get corrected all the time for mundane reasons. An earlier surveyor's error, a resurveyed benchmark, ordinary bureaucratic housekeeping. But the timing sits uncomfortably close to the story, and nobody I've spoken with who has looked at the old plats has been able to point to the specific correction that supposedly justified it. The second thread is a set of missing photographs. The Nevada State Mining Bureau's accession records from the late 1940s list a small batch of glass plate negatives logged in under a General Geological Survey heading, catalogued but never printed, with a notation reading, in full, fieldwork, Lincoln County, withdrawn from box. When a researcher went looking for those plates decades later, cross-referencing the accession number against the physical collection, the box itself was there. The plates weren't in it. Whether they were ever in it, misfiled elsewhere in a state archive that has moved buildings more than once, or simply mislabeled from the start, is impossible to say from where I'm sitting. State archives lose things. That's not a conspiracy. That's just what happens to paper and glass over 80 years of relocations, inventories, and underfunded storage. The third thread, and the one that people in the district still talk about, involves the sketch, a hand-drawn geological cross-section, undated and unsigned, turned up in the 1980s, misfiled in an unrelated folder in a regional archive, tucked, of all places, into a box of survey material concerning an entirely different mining claim 40 miles away. It shows a cutaway of a lakebed with a shaded rectangular void beneath it, roughly to scale, with hatch marks along one edge that a couple of geologists, who've since looked at it, describe as resembling notations for fitted masonry rather than any natural rock formation. There's no name attached to the sketch. No survey number. Nothing connecting it to Halloran and Cobb, beyond the fact that someone, at some point, thought it belonged with mining paperwork from Lincoln County and filed it that way. And then there are the stakes, rock hounds and amateur historians who've hiked the margins of the restricted range boundary over the decades, carefully, and only where public access is legally permitted, since most of the lakebed itself has sat inside a closed military boundary since the 1950s, have reported finding old wooden survey stakes out past where any documented claim should exist. Weathered grey, some with faint stenciled lettering that a few people have read. As an H and a C, though the wood is old enough and cracked enough that this could just as easily be somebody's imagination doing the reading for them. I went looking for as much of this in person as the law and the calendar would allow. The Lincoln County Recorder's Office in Pioche still keeps its older ledgers in a back room that smells the way every small county archive in the rural West seems to smell. Dry paper, machine oil from an ancient microfilm reader, and underneath it something like hot dust, carried in on decades of boots. The clerk who pulled the 1947 book for me had never heard the Groom Lake story and wasn't especially interested in it. She was more concerned with whether I was going to put the ledger back in the right box. Page 118 is exactly as described. The ink of the original entry has gone the brown-black colour. Old iron gall ink turns with age. The word added beneath it is a different, bluer black. The the kind a fountain pen from the late 1940s or early 1950s would have laid down, which tells you only that it was added later, not how much later. I stood at the county line a few days after that, at the public boundary where the Nevada test and training range begins and where the lakebed itself becomes, for ordinary purposes, invisible. A flat, pale smear on the horizon behind a chain-link fence and a warning sign. Heat shimmer erasing its far edge before it ever reaches the mountains. You cannot get anywhere near the northeast shoreline Pruitt described. You can only stand at a legal distance and look at the general direction of it, which is its own kind of answer and its own kind of frustration. None of this, on its own, proves anything. I want to say that plainly, because it would be easy to string these threads together into something that sounds more solid than it is. A missing firm, a redrawn boundary, some lost photographic plates, an unsigned sketch, a few weathered stakes, and one old rancher's memory of a story he was told when he was 19 years old, sitting around a fire in the dark, by two men who were badly frightened by something. That's the entire foundation. It is not, by any responsible measure, evidence of an ancient buried structure. It's evidence that something unusual happened to the paperwork and that a story took root in a small, tight-knit desert community and never quite died out. Those are different things, and I don't want to blur them for you. There is one more source worth mentioning, though I'll flag its limits honestly. A woman living in Caliente, Nevada, who by her own account is a granddaughter of one of Walter Pruitt's ranch hand contemporaries, got in touch with a regional history society in the early 2000s, claiming her family kept a handful of loose papers passed down from that era. A page of penciled figures, some kind of rough elevation sketch, nothing bound or titled. She described the papers in a letter that the society still has on file, but she never donated the originals, and by the time anyone followed up in person, she said she could no longer find the box they'd been kept in. It may have been misplaced in a move. It may never have existed in the form she remembered it. I mention it not because it proves anything. It plainly doesn't. It's a second-hand description of an undonated, unverified document. But because it's one more instance of the same shape recurring. Something that might have mattered. One step removed from being examined, and then gone. What I will say is that once you start looking for this particular shape of story, you start noticing how often it shows up across the American West, wearing different clothes. A few hundred miles northwest of Groom Lake, in the Lovelock Valley, sits a cave that guano miners broke into in 1911 while digging out decades of bat droppings for fertilizer. What they found first was mundane. A rich deposit of guano worth hauling out by the ton. But as they dug deeper, they started turning up woven artifacts, tools, and eventually human remains. Material that archaeologists would go on to study seriously for the better part of a century. Long before any of that excavation happened, the northern Paiute people who had lived in the region for generations already had an account of that cave and others like it in the area. An oral tradition describing a people they called the Ziteka, often translated loosely as tule eaters, remembered in the telling as unusually tall and said to have been driven into caves and destroyed by the ancestors of the Paiute after years of conflict. Over the 20th century, that oral tradition got tangled up with newspaper exaggeration about giant skeletons pulled from Lovelock Cave. claims that serious anthropological examination of the actual excavated remains does not support. What's real is a documented cave, real archaeological material, and a genuine, older oral tradition. What got layered on top of it, decade after decade, is a much taller tale, in more than one sense of the word. It's a useful pattern to keep in mind. An authentic indigenous account, a real archaeological site, and a legend that grew well beyond either of them once it left local hands. Farther south, in the Superstition Mountains east of Phoenix, there's the story of the Lost Dutchman Mine, a fabulously rich gold deposit supposedly worked in secret by a German immigrant prospector named Jacob Waltz in the late 19th century, its location dying with him in 1891, and never rediscovered despite something like a century and a half of searching, several deaths among those who went looking, and an entire subculture of treasure hunters who still comb that range today. Nobody disputes that Waltz was a real person, or that he apparently did have gold from somewhere. What nobody has ever been able to nail down, despite enormous effort, is where it actually came from. And due west of Groom Lake, across the Nevada-California line, there's the older and stranger case of Charles Breyfogle, a prospector who stumbled out of the desert near Death Valley in 1864. Disoriented, half out of his mind, carrying ore samples of the kind of quality that made assayers sit up straight, and unable to reliably describe where he'd found them. He spent years afterward, and other men spent decades after that, trying to relocate the Breyfogle ledge, and it has never been found if it ever existed as a single identifiable deposit at all, rather than a confused prospector's account of ordinary rock formations refracted through thirst, heat, and possibly a head injury. 3 different stories, 3 different centuries of storytelling, 3 different states of the American West. A real cave layered with an exaggerated legend. A real man's real gold that nobody can relocate. A real prospector's disoriented account that hardened, over a century of retelling, into a fixed local legend with its own name. Once you notice the pattern, it's difficult to stop seeing it. The desert produces just enough physical evidence and just enough human unreliability to keep a story alive indefinitely without ever quite proving or disproving it. I don't think that makes the Groom Lake story true. I think it might make it explainable, as folklore, as a version of a very old story the American West tells about itself, retold with a new set of props. But I'll admit that explanation doesn't fully satisfy me either, and I've read enough county archive boxes at this point to know that ordinary bureaucratic loss is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Here's the last piece, and then I'll leave it where it belongs, which is unresolved. Whatever was or wasn't out on that lakebed in April of 1947, the physical setting where it supposedly happened didn't stay untouched for long. In 1955, when the Air Force selected Groom Lake for the U-2 program, construction crews moved in fast, grading the dry lakebed for use as a runway, building hangars and support structures, establishing the security perimeter that has defined the site ever since. Whatever might have been at that northeast shoreline, a covered opening, a filled trench, a scatter of old survey stakes, sat directly inside the footprint of a construction project that reshaped miles of that terrain within a matter of months. That's not an accusation. Nobody planned an airbase around an old rancher's story. There's no reason to think anyone building runways in 1955 had ever heard of Halloran and Cobb, and I'm not suggesting otherwise. It's simply what happened to that stretch of desert, on a timeline that happens to run directly through the spot where the legend is set. Access to that shoreline has been restricted for entirely well-documented and unrelated national security reasons for the 70 years since. If there was ever anything to find, the window for finding it by ordinary means closed a long time ago, for reasons that have nothing to do with buried stone doors. In the decades since, the Regional Historical Society in Lincoln County has fielded a slow, steady trickle of letters and phone calls from people who'd heard some version of the story second-hand, from a grandfather, from a bartender in Alamo, from a photocopied zine passed around a rock collecting club, asking whether the society had any record of a 1947 survey gone strange. The answers given back have always been the same, and they're the honest ones. No confirmed record beyond the ledger entry itself, no verified photographs, no way to independently corroborate an oral history collected a quarter-century after the fact from a single elderly witness. That hasn't stopped the letters from arriving. It rarely does with stories like this one. And the records themselves simply thinned out the way rural county records do. Lincoln County's archives moved buildings more than once over the following decades. State Mining Bureau collections were reorganized, recatalogued, and in some cases damaged by water and neglect before anyone thought to properly preserve them. A small oral history archive from the 1970s sat in cassette form in a filing cabinet for years before anyone digitized it. None of that requires a hidden hand. It only requires what happens to paper, tape, and glass in under-resourced archives across 70 years of an underpopulated stretch of the American West. But it means that the one specific window when this story could have been checked against hard evidence, 1947, before the grading, before the fence, before the file boxes went missing, closed almost as soon as it opened, and every trace left afterward is second-hand, misfiled, or gone. I keep coming back to that ledger in Pioche, page 118, April 3rd, 1947. 2 names, a destination 11 miles northeast of the Groom mine, and underneath it, in different ink, in a different hand, added at some later date nobody recorded. Returned? Returned from what, exactly is the question the paper record can't answer, and neither, as far as I can tell, can anyone still living. Maybe it means nothing more than 2 men finished a routine survey and drove back to town, the same as they would have on any other job. And a clerk closed the file the way clerks close 1,000 files. Maybe Walter Pruitt, 70 years old and speaking into a stranger's tape recorder, was remembering a story more than he was remembering an event, the way memory tends to do to us all given enough decades. Or maybe that word was written by someone who knew exactly what those 2 men had seen underground and chose, in the smallest possible way, to mark that they'd made it back out. I don't know which of those it is. I'm not sure, at this distance, that anyone can.